Welcome to Acton Line, a product of the Acton Institute promoting a free and virtuous society. I'm Mark Townsend, producer. You can find additional resources in the show notes for this episode, as well as previous episodes of Acton Line at acton.org/podcasts. If you have a comment or an idea for a future episode, you can email us at podcast@acton.org. Acton Line is available to stream on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, and acton.org.
Welcome. My name is Dan Huger, librarian and research associate at the Acton Institute, and today I'm joined by Eric Kohn, CEO of America's Future. Many of you will soon have your ears burning. Those of you watching us on video may have your eyes burning because Eric is former communications director at the Acton Institute and was for many years the host of this podcast and Acton Unwind, our weekly roundtable discussion. Eric, welcome to Acton Line, and thanks for being with us.
Thank you for having me. It's good to be back here behind this particular microphone.
So, yesterday in Los Angeles, Waymos were on fire. America's Future, overrated or underrated?
I think the future of America is almost always underrated, and you can go back through history and you can see examples of people predicting all kinds of doom. You can go back to even the era of the Founding Fathers and wondering whether or not this republic, if we could keep it, was going to sustain and thrive. And frequently, when those challenges have been on the table, they have been met by Americans. And one of the things that America's Future, the organization, is looking to do is better educate and impart not only the ideas of liberalism and human freedom that I think we all share, better inculcate those ideas into younger people in this country, but we also want to provide them training and opportunities to improve their skill sets to become better and more effective advocates for those ideas in their own walks of life.
So there's two steps here, and I think it's very important because there are a lot of organizations, including the Acton Institute. We try to do our part in our little circles to advance this sort of conservative liberalism, this fusionism, this some folks will say libertarianism. I have a story, I had an old professor at Hillsdale College, a professor of sociology, Peter Blum. Sociology is a notoriously left-wing discipline, and he would often get sort of skeptical glances from his students, as they went into his intro to sociology class as to what they were going to get from him. And he would always say, well, I could pass for a libertarian in these ways, or I could pass for a conservative if by what a conservative means this. I could pass for a liberal if it means this. And I probably couldn't ever pass as a socialist for these sorts of reasons. And this is the way that he would put, young sort of firebrand conservative students at ease with, you have a steady hand in your sociology course. That sort of ideological stuff is one step, but then there's this whole other step of putting people at ease, sometimes with each other, in what can be, there are a lot of people that love America's founding vision but have very different sort of ways of unpacking that, and a lot of sort of hostility to other people who might even share that. I think you and I would always share back the Groundskeeper Willie meme of talking about,
the different kinds of libertarians, it's libertarians who ruined libertarianism. Yeah. So it's the going back to what you were just saying about academics, right? It's like those kinds of academic fights are always the most vicious because they're in some senses over so very little.
Yeah. So one of the things that I always, my conception of America's Future was that it worked on the one hand on that level, but more intensely on that social level, of a sort of networking level, of a sort of career development angle, as you talked about. How does the mechanics of that work? Both, because you do some on the ideas level, but you do a lot on this sort of sociological base level of just introducing people to each other, fostering community. How do you see that? How's that split up in the work that America's Future does?
So to talk about that role for America's future, I want to talk a little bit about America's past, or at least America's future past.
Yeah.
Not in the conjugation sense, but in the past of the organization America's Future. So this is actually our 30th anniversary year. We were founded in 1995 in Washington, D.C. by a group of 8 people who recognized a need out there. And the need was, general idea, on all the alphabet soup nonprofit organizations that are out in D.C. that were on the center-right. We can get into the whole right-left terminological thing later because I'm actually interested in it, and I think it does apply here. But identifying the younger people there wanted the experience that their bosses had and that their bosses were often invited to participate in. The things like panel discussions or speaking opportunities or opportunities to debate philosophy, ideology, policy ideas. And recognizing that they were on the young end of that and that they weren't getting these invitations, they decided, well, let's start our own institution so that we can do that amongst ourselves. So the bread and butter for years for AF was the member-sourced panel discussion. You'd have 3 or 4 people up there on a panel. You would have a policy topic or something relevant within the ideological firmament of the greater center-right, and people would debate those. Another key part of it, as you mentioned, was happy hours. I went spelunking through the old AF website on the Internet Archive Wayback Machine, and I found this really great bit there about never underestimating the value of having a good time. And that they went on to say that whether you're a conservative, libertarian, Randian, neoconservative, anarcho-capitalist, there's a place for you here. And we plan to carry that spirit into AF's next 30 years. But the happy hour, too, was always a really important part of what we did because getting people together to meet each other, to know each other better, to build those kinds of networks that are necessary for not just advancing your career, but really your life. So much of life is who we know and building those relationships with important people. So we wanted to provide an opportunity to do that. Now, where we're going in the next 30 years, let me quickly give you the vision that I've outlined to our staff and our team of where I see us going. The first is I want to redefine somewhat how we viewed the ideological battle, the ideas part of it. We would talk regularly about, again, going back to those terms right and left and whether they're helpful or not helpful. And there's problems in the libertarians would always tell you, it's like they get thrown in on the right and they don't conceive of themselves as being right or left. And then you get the world's smallest political quiz diamond, and now we're placing people there. And set that aside for a minute and just use the typical understandings of right and left. That the left was advancing and that we were looking to push back against them. I think the challenge right now is better explained a little differently. 15 years ago, if you would have told me, or if you would have made the argument to me about horseshoe theory, I probably would have laughed at you. To borrow from Jonah Goldberg, someone with a long history with AF as well, him and Nick Gillespie used to do regular conservative versus libertarian debates for AF back in the heyday. His line on this was that nowhere else in life do we make that kind of argument. Nobody is so tall that they are short. Nobody is so fat that they are thin. Bulldog puppies maybe are the exception, that they are so ugly that they are cute, but again, exception that proves the rule. But over the last 10, 12 years, we've started to watch it happen in real time, where the illiberal elements of the right and the left share some rather striking similarities. And as that horseshoe bends down to the points starting to come close to touching each other, I think there's opening at the top. And what AF in its history has often described itself as doing is building the next generation of classical liberal leaders. Because going back to the laundry list of different sub-ideologies that exist on the center-right, or even in the center, again, depending on how you want to phrase that, what they all shared in common was that even let's look at conservatives for a moment. What are American conservatives in the normal understanding of the American conservative tradition trying to conserve? a liberal Enlightenment revolution that was the basis for the founding of this country. Small L liberalism, as we've often had to modify it, classical liberalism, has been the core for really all of those groups. There's overlaps, they all overlap the Venn diagram of liberalism. So I think that is the battle that is going on today, is between liberalism and illiberalism. I think we will conduct ourselves accordingly. So what do we do about that? We run educational programs, skills training programs, professional development programs for people between the ages of 22 and 40. It's a really critical age. There's all kinds of groups out there that serve college students. And by the time you're in your 40s, I'm in my early 40s, you've really established, what your circle is, what are the institutions you're involved in, who are the people in your network. And what we want to do is help get people to that point in a little better and more organized way, give them opportunities to learn things that most people learn really only through trial and error, soft skills like, you're in a new job, managing up is one of your responsibilities. Well, how do you do that effectively? We want to help increase people's skill sets within the job context, as well as just the general interpersonal context. And from a general understanding, going back to the first point, how do they become better and more effective advocates for the ideas that they believe in? Recognizing, again, this is coalitionally speaking, one of the things I always thought was a strength of the American right was its willingness to debate amongst itself and debate its own dogma on a pretty regular basis. And we want to model that kind of behavior going forward, because I always thought it was one of the things that made that movement particularly strong. So within our programming, education, skill set building, community building being the primary focuses there. And then the third point of what I want to do that I think will be a unique value add in the space, as listeners to this podcast and the other one that I hosted here at Acton will know, one of the first items on maybe the center square of the bingo card for me was a reference to Yuval Levin. I have learned a lot from Yuval's work, particularly on institutions and the importance of institutions. And there is social science to suggest that when faith and trust in institutions falls for too long a period of time to too low of a level, that is where you come at risk for some kind of societal collapse. I think people have underrated the importance of institutions. A lot of them have not acquitted themselves very well in the modern era, and there's all kinds of reasons for that, and we can get into it if you really want to. But one of the things that I want to do is to teach people the importance of seeing themselves as operators within institutions. There's a long American history and tradition of this, right? I'm paraphrasing, but de Tocqueville essentially said anytime 3 or 4 Americans get together, they elect a treasurer. That kind of spirit of building things when we need to solve problems, especially if we are concerned about the role of the state, and we want to minimize, may disagree as to what extent, but we want to minimize the role of the state and maximize individual people willingly coming together to accomplish things jointly that they could, if they couldn't accomplish on their own, at least would be very difficult to accomplish on their own. An understanding of the importance of institutions like that and how to operate in them. As Yuval says, really the critical question to ask yourself in any institution that you are a part of is, given my role here, what should I do? Not necessarily what is the best thing to advance my own individual personal interests, but given my role here, what should I do? And in coming together to do those things willingly in institutions we construct ourselves, at least we're not ceding the ground to the state to come in and say, well, nobody is doing this, so clearly now we have to. So I want people to better appreciate and understand how to operate within institutions. They exist to accomplish something, and that your character can and should be formed by them in the process. And if you don't want your character being formed by an institution that you're a part of, well, you probably shouldn't be part of that institution. And then being considerate of that going forward, enter into ones, build ones that you want to help form people's character in the direction of what it is you're trying to build and what it is you're trying to accomplish.
Eric, thank you. This is a great overview and gives me a lot to sort of dive in on. One of the interesting things when you talk about the origins of America's future, a lot of young people wanting some space to sort of work out their ideas in real time. And they didn't have that space, so they made their own, which ties into your last point. But how do you balance that with educational See, there's an educational function here. When you're talking about these sort of member-only panels, this reminded me when I was in Hillsdale. I was a member of the Fairfield Society, which was a philosophy theology discussion panel that was run by students. It was all student-submitted voluntary papers that they would come read, discuss. Faculty would show up, and faculty could ask questions, and they could critique, but there were never any faculty presenters in any of these meetings. This was all student-led. That was really helpful in my thinking through a lot of ideas as an undergraduate student. But there's also like a lot I learned from actual experts that, had well-developed opinions. And you mentioned, Nick Gillespie, Jonah Goldberg coming before these audiences. How do you balance that from like giving a platform to members to make these arguments themselves, to learn by doing, versus bringing experts in to America's Future members to sort of expand their horizons and introduce them to new ideas that maybe they wouldn't have considered on their own?
Different tracks of programming have different purposes. So one of the things I left out in my overview is America's Future has these chapters and hubs throughout the country, areas outside of Washington, D.C., where we're active and do programming. Personally, I led the Chicago chapter of America's Future for more than 10 years, from roughly 2010 through like 2021 when I moved here to Grand Rapids. A lot of the programming and events that those chapters do are simultaneously a mix of that. We did a lot of debates amongst our members, panel discussions sourced from our membership. We also did a lot of programming where we brought in people who had an expertise on something to talk about it. I think both of those are important. Giving people the space to work these things out in our event programming is one of the things that we do. Giving them opportunities to hear from people with an expertise in our event programming is part of what we do. And then another key focus are these fellowship cohorts that we have. Our writing fellows, create fellows, go fellows, lead fellows, all of them geared towards education and skill building in certain areas. Writing, marketing, and the creative space, activism, and then just general leadership. Those are areas where we have curriculum that people are working through, learning skills, doing projects, better understanding how to build and use these skills going forward. So there's a balance to be struck there, and I think we have a balance amongst the kinds of programming and events that we do that give people the opportunity to hear from people with an expertise, to build their own sense of expertise, and to explore ideas in productive and creative ways. And then educational programming that helps them build their skill sets with expert instructors, people who have done this, who know how, have experience in these areas, know how it works, and can effectively communicate those ideas and build those skill sets within the people that they're teaching.
One of the things that you highlighted here, which is one of the fascinating things, I've always been interested in the work that America's Future does, is this regional model where you have these hubs. We used to, I believe we no longer have, but we used to have a Grand Rapids chapter
Correct.
Of America's Future. It has actually had meetings in the Acton building. I remember going to one of those meetings. They had an event with state legislatures. They had 3 different legislators from 3 different states talking about sort of the nuts and bolts of what it is to do their jobs, that I thought was really informative and really worthwhile. With those sort of regional hubs, what are the advantages there? As somebody who worked as a sort of a regional, somebody who worked on the ground in Chicago doing this sort of thing, what are the strengths of that? What are some of the challenges with dealing with an organization that, tries to have, a polycentric organization in a lot of ways?
It really is a subsidiarity model. We understand that the people who are on the ground in those areas of the country where we have chapters, that we have hubs, have local knowledge that the central planners in Washington, D.C., I kid. Those of us at FHQ in Washington, D.C., just don't have and never will have. Rewind 15-ish years to when I first started leading the Chicago chapter. Again, the purpose of AF when it was founded in D.C. was the career advancement, skill development of a lot of those people who were junior staffers, new staffers at a lot of those organizations, building networks of people at different organizations. As you know and I know, a lot of those people move around organization to organization a lot. If you wanted to work professionally in the liberty movement in Chicago, back when I was leading that chapter, you had really 3 opportunities to do so, living locally. Again, an era before remote work was really mainstreamed. The 3 opportunities were the Sam Adams Alliance, which does not exist anymore, the Acton Institute, which was headquartered in downtown Chicago, moved out to the suburbs at some point during my time as a chapter leader there, and then the Illinois Policy Institute, where I used to work. And I realized pretty quickly that the odds were, if that was what your professional interest was in, you already knew that. You already knew what those opportunities were. Most of the people who came to our events had an interest in these ideas on a personal level rather than really a professional level. What we tried to do as a chapter was make understanding that we could debate some things amongst ourselves, but, had this basis for agreement of like, these are the ideas, almost Margaret Thatcher-like, of coming in with the Constitution of Liberty and slamming it on the table and saying, this is what we believe. Yeah. We had that agreement. So what are we going to do then for people who work at BMO Harris Bank and not the Illinois Policy Institute? So we designed our programming around the idea of making people better and more effective communicators of those ideas, so that when conversations came up at the literal or the proverbial water cooler at work, they were better positioned to be able to explain and defend what they believed and to interrogate the other belief systems of people around them. We do a lot of the same kinds of things now. The programming that you'll see from our chapter in Austin, Texas, is very different from our programming in Atlanta versus what's happening in California versus what's happening in the Northeast, because just like the great thing about this country, it's a great and weird place to drive across. Different states have very different characteristics. Different cities have different priorities and concerns. And having local people on the ground who live in those areas, who understand what is important there, helps them construct programming that speaks to the mission of America's future and continues in furtherance of that mission, but that speaks directly to the interests and concerns of people living in those cities in that moment in time, and allows them to explore and discuss those ideas, those issues, and then of their own accord figure out if they want to get more involved in working to solve those problems. Hopefully we've built an understanding and a skill set in you, and now take it and apply it in the world.
So that base level skill of just, you come here, you're part of this because you believe in this broad sort of orientation towards government, responsibility, freedom. Maybe you don't know how to articulate it that great. This is a place where you can develop those skills from a sort of water cooler level on up. Like you mentioned, a writing fellows program. Now that's one step above the water cooler. How does that work? Because this is something that, again, one of the great things about this country is, there are a plethora of newspaper outlets, media opportunities that ordinary citizens can really engage in. They can write letters to the editor. They can write op-eds. One of the interesting things that, as I've developed as a writer is like people really, there's still a demand for written material. People talk about, the death of journalism and the rest of it. And there are real structural challenges to that, but like people are still starved for good content. And if you can write clean copy that puts forward a clear point of view that is reasonable and intelligible and can be followed, there is a place for you to be able to place and publish that in really broad segments of media, in folks that might not even be, as institutions, friendly to that sort of perspective. They're looking for somebody to give a voice to it in their pages because they realize like-minded people are out there. What do you do to take that to that sort of level with your members?
Yeah, Bill Gates was right. Content is king. And you mentioned the structural issues with journalism, which certainly we can see. But to your point, how many Substack subscriptions do I have now, right? Like it's funny to me that I think the evolution or re-evolution we're going to eventually get to there is we have all these individual interesting writers who have their own Substack. And boy, Dan, it sure would be great if someone could figure out a way to like bundle them together in some way, something like you could call like a newspaper or something like that, or a digital newspaper if you
must. It'd be great
if
we could do this for streaming services,
wouldn't it? Wouldn't it? Yeah, it's like you could call it cable or
things.
something like that. It's somebody. If you think this is a good idea and you're hearing it out there, call me. Again, happy to share it. So our Writing Fellows program is writing is a skill. I'm already eagerly anticipating reading the new Tannenhouse biography of Bill Buckley. But for somebody who was as voluminous a writer as he was, he would confess that he didn't enjoy doing it. But I think there's a very important lesson in there, which is, it's a friend of mine who once said that I hate everything I've ever written except for the most recent piece. And then when I write something new, that will also fall into the category of things that I hated. But just in any creative sense, you learn from those experiences of having written something. And the only way to find out really what the value is to put it out into the world and see what people think of it. Writing is a skill, and it is something that you get better at over time. And we're fortunate to have Matt Purple, who's an experienced writer in this format and style, being able to help work with young people who want to better their writing skills, make sure that they are the most effective forms of making an argument. Because really in that kind of writing style that we're teaching, that's what we're teaching is how to make an argument in writing and to make it as effectively as you possibly can. That is a skill set that if your interest is in being, anything from the next George Will to somebody within an institution, I was a writer when I was at here as well as at the Illinois Policy Institute, to be able to serve the institution that you are a part of. But those are also skills that serve just about anybody if you know how to do them well. Being able to make an argument and to make an argument in writing are important skills that will serve anybody working at a bank, a financial institution, a creative agency, just about any job you can think of out of there in the professional services kind of world. You'll benefit from those skills. So we really see a cross-application of what we're doing for people who, again, are in the professional realm of the liberty movement, the nonprofit space that you and I occupy, but also skills that will benefit people who will never personally formally work in that space, but can learn simultaneously something about the ideas of liberty and human freedom, as well as the skill sets of writing and making an argument that they can apply to their lives, their professional lives, their personal lives, and the things that they care about, and they can carry those skills forward.
When we talk about these sorts of skills, you want people to develop these skills, but you also want to place them into institutions. Now, part of that is, they're maybe members of their AF chapter, and that's a sort of institutional placement. But you are very sort of self-consciously, you want to be that funnel point where, yes, they're members and you hope to retain them as members, but you want to move them into other places where the skills they develop can be best deployed. How do you, part of the challenge of, when we talk about this broader liberty nonprofit movement, there's sort of two ways of thinking about it. And one is that you want your institution to be the be-all, end-all articulation of that. And you want to be the home to all the best thinkers, all the best scholars, all the best writers. And it's naturally to sort of want that. But it's also the strength of all of these institutions is as part of a broader movement. Mm-hmm. And the way that they can feed and shape talent that goes off into other parts of that movement that develops along its own lines. And all of these organizations are actually more effective if they're more narrow and targeted in their focus. So it's a world in which I think it actually makes a lot of sense for there to be a lot of different institutions doing a lot of different things, because a lot of people have different talents, different approaches, different audiences in what can be a very ideologically fractured space. How do you think about that? How do you think about AF as a funnel to other institutions, or as you know, yeah? How do you view that larger networking role that AF plays?
Yeah, we are an institution, and people are members of it. You know, we see ourselves as a facilitator in a lot of ways of helping people to improve themselves, and as such improve the organizations that they work for. So there's a previous place that I worked had this statement of values that you got when you started working there. And one of them was, we want our people to be successful, even if it means being successful someplace else. Well, most of those people are will be members in some sense. They'll be attendees. They'll participate in programs. And we want them to retain that affiliation to AF going forward. But most of them, their professional occupation are with different organizations other than us. And we want them to be able to grow in their roles and their own professional careers in those institutions. You're absolutely right about the importance of institutions in the concept, and a narrowish concept of what they do and what they're trying to accomplish. I mean, people don't just get together to get together. It's hard to hold an institution together just on that alone. People get together to try to do something together. And going back to Yuval's example in this of how institutions have changed over time, and not for the better, is he'll say, take, for example, Harvard and the New York Times. Those are two different institutions with different visions, different missions, different, what they do is different. And in Yuval's argument here, he would say they've essentially become the same institution, where they are now platforms that people stand on top of and complain, largely about oppression, but about a bunch of other things. They're not supposed to be identical in that way. The New York Times is a journalistic institution. Harvard is an educational institution. I think it's important that we start inculcating into people as early as possible that institutions are there to accomplish something should be clear and specific. And that if you're entering into that institution, your role there is to help further that mission. And what a lot of those people who are standing on top of institutions now and acting performatively, they're advancing a very narrow sense of their own individual self-interest. But they're not doing a whole lot to help the organization that they are a part of in furtherance of its mission. So I think the reason I've latched onto this is I think, well, one, I can't come up with a better idea of how to drive this home to people other than to teach it and make it a part of what we do from a curricular perspective. But I also just think it's so incredibly important. If we're going to have trust in institutions, we need to know that they're doing, or at least striving to do, the things that they say that they are going to do, and having people within them who understand and adopt that mission as their own, who ask themselves the question of, given my role here, what should I do, helps move those institutions in that direction. And as I said before, you really get into some dangerous territory when people have so little faith in the institutions around them. I don't know if it will lead to societal collapse. I am still very bullish on the future of this country and this culture. But it's something that will need to be addressed and overcome. And really the only way, this is why I love the book that Yuval wrote that a lot of this is drawn from, is called A Time to Build. It's not a time to reform. Reform is absolutely a part of that. And the institutions that already exist out there that can be reformed, we should engage in that process. But it's also a time to build new things. When things aren't working, there's an opportunity out there to build new things that address those problems and learn the lessons that those other institutions have gone in, and really try to pull people together so that they're all asking that question simultaneously of, I have a role here in furtherance of this bigger mission. Like we talked about this a lot when I was here at Acton. The desire that people have to feel a part of something larger than themselves is innate and innately human. And having people understand when you're willingly entering into an institution like that, the exchanges that, you ask yourself that question, it will help make you a better person and shape your character as a result of it. And if you find yourself in a toxic place, leave and find someplace better, or start building your own that addresses the problem that you see in the world. There are all kinds of different ways to solve these problems. And, we don't think of it from a top-down way of, we need this institution to do this and this one to do this. It is a much more organic bottom-up process of people figuring out what the needs are, particularly locally, and then acting to either find people who are working on that and join their cause, or to start building their own institution and program that starts addressing the issues that they see close to them.
I'm wondering because AF's audience is a younger audience. They're looking at that, targeting that 22 to 40-year-old demographic. And we've seen, trend stories for probably about a decade about how, one of the leading career aspirations of young people is to be an influencer or a YouTube personality or that sort of thing. Do you find in working with a younger cohort, and I feel so strange saying this, you and I are both on the cusp that if you were not CEO of America's future, you would not, you've aged out of membership. I have aged out of that demographic as well. When you see these younger folks who, a lot of them, just to be fair to them, grew up in a time of the degrading of these institutions. They've seen a lot of stuff happening in institutions that makes them hesitant to get involved, to get invested, and, at a time and a place when you can leverage technology to all of a sudden establish a personal brand apart from institutions. How do you make the case for younger folks that actually this institutional path is worth doing, and this should be your focus, particularly early career, is developing the skills, contributing to established institutions, or trying to, build your own institution beyond just a YouTube channel?
I think it's a both and question. So one of the things that we are actually launching this year is under our Create cohort is influencer training. Now, the understanding within that is we want people who will identify an area of expertise that they have or that they are actively cultivating. And what I want our program to do from a curricular perspective is to help them avoid what always drove me crazy about, let's use Noam Chomsky as an example. Noam Chomsky, a very smart and talented linguist, leveraged his credibility in one area to talk about all kinds of different areas in which he did not possess the same kind of expert knowledge
like
that
Cambodia.
he did, like Cambodia, that he did in linguistics. I the reason we want people to identify the area of expertise that they are cultivating is to teach them that, yes, we will impart to you the skills necessary to build, your brand as an influencer in this area. But part of the deal is going to be you focus on just this area. So if, regulatory reform or occupational licensing reform is your area, then it's not that you can't have opinions on the conflict between Israel and Gaza, but you don't want to leverage your credibility to talk about something that is not your area of expertise. So much of the institutional problems and individual problems that I see are people who did have expertise in an area that is undeniable, but leveraging it for credibility in places that they don't possess the same expertise. Expertise in and of itself is not a bad thing. We really are in a populist moment right now where the fashionable thing is to doubt people with expertise. And I don't think that that's healthy or productive. I think it's perfectly fine to have a skepticism about the policy applications of, some of those areas of expertise. We've talked about this before on podcasts that the CDC has only one writ, and that is preventing disease. And in the same way that if you really wanted to prevent every possible car crash, then you could lower the speed limit to 5 miles an hour and you could erect, 10-foot tall barriers on either side of the highway. That would be in furtherance of that. Is it worth the cost? And one needs to consider these things in a sense of balancing there. But we can look back and we can identify people who we didn't apply the term influencer to them back then. Usually we use the term public intellectual, which is even in and of itself a funny term because Christopher Hitchens would often say, is there a private intellectual? But you can point to examples of people like that who, again, spoke on an area of expertise and brought a credibility with them. And we really want people to understand that it is in their personal interest to be active in the area of their expertise and to not give people the reason to be like, well, you don't know anything about this. Why are you telling me about this? It actually is harmful to their own individual interests to do that Chomsky-like leveraging. And the last thing I would say is that there are definitely generalists out there. There's a need for generalists and popularizers of ideas. And this is kind of its own specific, unique skill set. And we want to help develop the nuts and bolts of that as well. It is, like most things, a balancing act. But I think if we can be successful in teaching people how, one, you can make yourself better, but also the best way to be more effective is to be doing it in concert with other people, willingly, people coming together of their own choosing, seeing a need or seeing a problem that needs to be addressed, and then coming together to address that problem. So their skill as somebody who can influence others in furtherance of that mission or goal is the way that they can be most effective in their career, and not just as a single person standing on a soapbox alone, hollering and hoping that people will listen, but doing about so many disparate topics that you're kind of eroding your own effectiveness, I think, in that process.
Yeah, you've got an interesting tension where influencers develop and cultivate an intimacy and a sort of parasocial relationship with their audiences. I think this is what makes them different from sort of public intellectuals. The public intellectual, although even then,
I was going to say,
if they're on television, the Buckley-esque witticisms and stuff, you learn a little bit more about them than the subject at hand.
Even going back to, the dawn of radio, and I would imagine ever since the printing press as well, yes, it has gotten easier to develop these kinds of parasocial relationships. But, as somebody before parasocial relationship was ever a term that I had heard, a really effective radio broadcaster, you absolutely build up the best and most effective ones, make you feel like they're talking to you, directly to you. It is, you go back and you watch, videos of, I was always a huge fan of these lectures from Milton Friedman that were on YouTube. They're actually supposed to originally be the building blocks for the Free to Choose series before they realized that like doing it off of lectures like this was not going to work. But you can, parasocial now, as we say, it sounds so derogative, but like you can build a familiarity with those people, have your life influenced by them in really important ways. And I mentioned Buckley earlier. Certainly, he was a person who influenced lots of people in the American conservative movement and on the American right. And I think I would say largely in positive ways, but seeing somebody being an example of, what it is that they wish to strive for, I think was a good thing. So these kinds of balancing acts have always been out there, but you look at people like Milton Friedman, who was attached to a number of different universities and the Hoover Institution at the end. You look at somebody like William F. Buckley, who not only built a movement, but built institutions within that movement. Young Americans for Freedom is what basically comes out of the Sharon Statement that happens at Buckley's family home in Sharon, Connecticut. He builds National Review. He is helpful in the furtherance of all kinds of different institutions with very specific missions, and understood how to balance those things. As in so many things in life, it's all a sense of balancing. This is another example of this that I really like. You've seen, I imagine, the movie City Slickers.
Oh, yeah.
Right. I love that movie. But the thing about it that annoys me is the bit from Curly, right? And it's like, what is the meaning of life? It's this, right? It's one thing. He holds up a single finger. It's one thing. No, it's not. If you only cared about one thing, you would be, let's just say that it's your wife is the only thing that you care about. That's the one thing, right? Man, you'd be a terrible father. You'd be a terrible employee wherever you worked. You would be a terrible congregant of whatever church that you go to, because everything would be geared towards. You'd also, probably be a pretty terrible husband in that sense too, if everything was about that. It is understanding that it is a balancing of things in your life, and it's been going on forever. So as with most of these kinds of problems we're facing now, they're not new. The inflection of them and the characteristic of them may have changed, but there's always been the need for that balancing between people's personal influence and platforms and what they're doing in furtherance of their ideas, and seeing that it's most effectively done throughout history channeled through institutions.
How much of this could be solved by just a more careful message discipline from folks? And part of what that involves is you have to have networks of people that you can turn to when somebody asks you a broader question about an area outside your expertise. I understand the pressure to feel that you should answer that, but you could always pass it along and say, you know what, this isn't my area of expertise, but let me tell you about this person, let me tell you about this institution that could maybe address your question better. That involves you sort of, you have to renounce, a sort of comprehensive guru status. Mm-hmm. But that message discipline is very, very hard. Is that something that you try to inculcate to these influencers that you're trying to cultivate? You're trying to cultivate within them an expertise, but do you also try to give them strategies for A, maintaining message discipline, or B, being able to serve their audiences with things that, referring them to others when there are relevant questions that fall outside their expertise.
Or if you've got a platform and you're interested in something that you don't know a lot about, go find somebody who knows a lot about it and bring them onto your platform to have a conversation like that. Now, I think that would be helpful as well. I don't think of it, and maybe this is my old political campaign brain kicking in, but I don't think of it in terms of message discipline, because I don't think it's really about adhering to a specific message as much as it is a sense of intellectual honesty about yourself. And part of it, too, and this is so trite, but encouraging people to be the change that they wish to see in the world, to act in the way that they wish more people would act. And part of that is, it comes on two sides here as I see it. One, having the confidence to be able to say, I don't know the answer to that question. And if you then have a platform, go out and find somebody who can give you a perspective on that, who does have that expertise. It takes courage and honesty to say, I don't know. And there's something kind of almost innately human where we don't want to tell people, I don't know the answer to that. And we try to contrive an answer. But there's something really not only responsible, but freeing in being able to say, I don't know what the answer to that is. Another part of it is also, it's okay to not have an opinion on everything. And more people should say that it's okay to not have an opinion on everything. We live in this digital age where all kinds of people will come down that you don't know, that you don't know from Adam. You may know online, but they are not the people, as you and I sitting here face to face talking to each other. That's a completely different type of relationship than people who are coming in online and telling you, no, you have to have an opinion on this. And the answer I'm telling all of you out there is you don't. You don't have to have an opinion on everything, especially if you just don't know a ton about it. Or at worst, do what I've strived to do for years. And as people who know, again, from these podcasts, that this one was mostly me asking questions of other people. But the other one, Act and Unwind, was us sharing what we think about things. I like to consider myself in a lot of those areas that I don't know a ton about, but I'm interested in, as having strong opinions weakly held, that you're open to being persuaded on these things. And I think an important part of that, going back to the first point I made about the mission of America's future, is when you have a solid understanding of what your first principles are, you can argue yourself into different places from those first principles as compared to other people starting from the same first principles and ending up in different places. That's totally fine. People are going to draw different conclusions, but at least understanding where you're coming from. What is the prism through which you're passing these things you're encountering? And then a willingness and a curiosity to learn more about them, find people who know more about them than you do. I'll conclude this riff with this, that you were talking about newspapers earlier. I'm sure you've had this experience as well as I do. My background has been in marketing, communications, but even, anything that you and I go down a rabbit hole on that we just happen to know a lot about, if you read something in the paper, you read a news article about it, about something you know a lot about, you'll almost instantly find a bunch of things that are in that article that's like, that's not quite right, and this is really debatable. I see how that's a commonly held perception, but the truth is a lot more nuanced than that. And then you'll move on and read something that you don't know a lot about, and most people are just like, yeah, I guess that's how it is. I think applying that skepticism that you recognize there and should apply forward I don't know a lot about this, but the thing I do know a lot about, there's some things that are wrong with that. I wonder if similar things are wrong with this one too. And really seek and pursue knowledge in that way, that, there's not one source of truth on all of these things. And going out there, investigating it, interrogating it, and trying to seek what the truth is of all of it is an active process. And we want to encourage that sense of curiosity in people, but a responsible curiosity.
Yeah. Cultivating this openness and curiosity is a very important dimension of this. And the other thing that I think about in an increasingly filterless world or seamless world in which these things, in which your opinion can reach millions,
whether you wanted to or not.
Yeah. Is that there's an ethical component to that too, and we see you'll get these internet dog piles on people, you'll get this public shaming, you'll get just a sort of dehumanization and degrading of other folks online, of ideological opponents or or just sort of just general cruelty that happens. And a lot of times that sort of thing gets attention because it's a spectacle, and it creates this sort of terrible spiral of people being terrible to each other. And perversely sort of all parties benefiting in one sense, the individual parties, while the public is left degraded with the broader audience. You have this internet of beefs. There's a we'll link this in the show notes. It's a piece
that's definitely on your bingo card. The internet of beefs one.
The internet of beefs is it looms large, and a lot of what influencers do today is these beefs and conflict is attention getting. Conflict really doesn't help institutions. And in fact, it undermines these sorts of things. Is all of a sudden, institutions are dragged into these sorts of conflicts, and it creates all of sorts of problems. And it creates difficulty for this honest and open engagement on the other hand, and it creates instability in institutions on the other hand. How do you meet that challenge while still trying to cultivate an audience and influence and persuade? It's a sort of shortcut to attention that a lot of people, I think, take, and I think it's really, really detrimental on the one hand, but it works in a cynical way on the other hand.
Yeah.
And how do we dissuade people trying to get into this business of being public intellectuals from degrading themselves and degrading their audience by exercising themselves like this on public platforms?
When I had a radio show in Chicago, my co-host and I had a segment on our weekly program where we talked exclusively about fast food. And I came up with this rubric for analyzing fast food restaurants that I called the regret quotient. And the operative question there is, how long after eating said establishment's offering did I feel regret for that decision? Now, there are some, big Wendy's guy here, I don't feel regret eating Wendy's. McDonald's, the regret I feel is pretty much instantaneous after the first bite. And I think a lot of that internet kind of culture, I find the regret quotient for most people, at least ones who have not built their entire personal model around that kind of thing, of just picking fights for the sake of picking fights to elevate themselves, to feel pretty early onset regret for participating in those kinds of things. Where I disagree a little bit is conflict can be helpful. It can be clarifying. Going back to what we were saying about especially if you read this, I did. You can put a link to this in the show notes. The episode where I interviewed Matt Continetti about his book, The Right. There's plenty of conflict that exists there, for good, for bad. Plenty of places in between. Conflict existed there. Again, thinking a lot about Buckley lately with this biography coming out, or that just came out. There's a great line that he had about the West Coast Straussian Harry Jaffa, that if you think it is hard disagreeing with Jaffa, try agreeing with him. There is just some cases where you're going to have conflict between people. It's not necessarily a bad thing. It can be clarifying. It can help change people's minds. You can find these letters between Buckley and John Kenneth Galbraith of them disagreeing on all kinds of things. He would bring people frequently onto firing line that he disagreed with. There was conflict there. But the whole idea that the conflict was helpful. Finding ways in the modern internet age where conflict is helpful and not harmful, I will confess, is more confounding than in previous media eras. I think we are starting and striving to figure it out, how we can do that. I think part of it is, the universities. You would typically see this kind of social pressure applied to them to make statements about things that have nothing to do with the operation of a university. I don't care what North Southwestern San Diego State University's position is on the conflict in Israel and Gaza. They are a place, as the University of Chicago so helpfully articulated, and for them, these things, people will say things and make statements and make arguments and cases underneath our umbrella, but we as an organization do not have official positions on these things. I think understanding that people can have those conflicts, and the people who lead institutions, it's up to them to be judicious about when they become conflicts that are going to be taken up by the institutions themselves. I mean, we see this in Congress. We talked about this plenty, and anytime Congress came up on any of these podcasts, that is a more jealous guardian of its prerogative and power. We need more people leading institutions who are jealous guardians of their prerogative and power in what the institution focuses on. So I think for AF's perspective, we are like that University of Chicago thing, an umbrella under which people can engage in these kinds of things. We don't want to encourage. We want to encourage people to do it in productive and respectful ways, to act as their best selves in all of this. People, I think, are far more rueful about the things they said out loud that they wish they didn't than things they wish they said out loud that they didn't at the time. And I think getting people to understand that. And one of the advantages I think we have is being able to teach, again, the 22-year-olds in 2025 have had this stuff as a part of the background of their lives or an active part of their lives in ways that you and I did not. Like, we're roughly the same age. Growing up in an internet age where when we were kids, the internet really was not a thing. My high school years were the days of dial-up internet. And then by the time I got to college, and especially out of college, it's like, okay, mainstreaming of permanent, everywhere, high-speed internet access is a thing. I said this numerous times on Acton Unwind and probably on Acton Line as well, that part of the challenge of the digital age like this is that it's only about 15 years old, and in the great sense of time, not very long. And yeah, there's going to be some adjusting that needs to go on in there, figuring out how we live with the existence of those things. I think you see in the work of people like Jonathan Haidt and others that were really starting to grapple with, what hath we wrought part of all of this. And in keeping with the underlying philosophy of the organization that I'm now leading, I believe it's up to individual people working together to come up with solutions to this and how we best moderate ourselves. I've got a 14-year-old daughter. It's about, just today, first day of summer break. And, some of the regulation when it comes to tech stuff, now at the age she's at, it's like we're giving you some trust and some personal authority over yourself and asking yourself to self-regulate. If you don't want mom and dad to come in and help you do it, then here's your challenge. And we hope to put that kind of a challenge out to more people of, here are the productive ways to engage in debate, which is conflict.
Yeah.
To do it productively. So here are some tips on how to avoid the pratfalls that people will get themselves into in especially online debates. And to avoid the problem, I think a key part of this and why we have localized in what the internet world would refer to as meat space, people getting together and getting to know each other personally, to avoid these problems where when somebody, let's use this example that, let's say you have a friend who says something that's a little, racially off color, not intended to be, they're not some raging grand wizard of the KKK. They're just, they say something poorly considered. You as a friend of that person who knows them in real life have the ability to pull them aside and say, that really wasn't cool and here's why. And because they know that you're their friend and you care about their well-being personally, they are likely more amenable to what you are saying to them than some random people. What we have had for far too long online is if people do something like that, they are immediately beset by two large groups of people whom they don't know personally. One of them wanting to excommunicate them from public life for forever, and the other saying, no, you're right, continue with all of that you're thinking there. Both are the wrong kinds of help and encouragement that person needs. We need more people to be the responsible one. You could only do it when you know people personally. And one of the reasons we want to build stronger networks amongst people is so that we can all help ourselves be the best version of ourselves.
Eric, thank you for leading America's future into this positive direction and helping folks become the best version of themselves in service to the American experiment in order to liberty.
Thank you, Dan.
Thank you for listening. If you'd like to learn more about Acton or hear more of this podcast, please visit acton.org/podcasts. Otherwise, we'll see you next week.